Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Anton Moscatelli. I'm a principal of the University of Glasgow, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you all to the university for this first of the 2018 Gifford Lecture Series. Can I start off just with an apology? I'm sorry we're starting a bit late, but it's taking a long time to get you all into the hall given the demand for this lecture, as you can see. So my role tonight is just to tell you a bit about the Gifford Lectures. They began in 1888, having been established through a substantial bequest from Lord Gifford. Gifford was born in Edinburgh in 1820, and he had two main interests in his life, the law and natural theology. As a lawyer, he moved up the ranks quickly, accumulating considerable wealth on the way. He was called to the bar in 1849 and became advocate depute in 1861, taking his seat as associate judge in the Court of Session as Lord Gifford in 1870. It was noted that he was popular as a lawyer, famed for his clear-headed thinking, his fairness, and his advocacy of common sense over legal technicalities. A wise man. But he was more than this. He was in great demand for public lectures. His subjects, however, did not cover jurisprudence, as you might have imagined, but ranged across his other great love, natural theology. Emerson, substance, Hindu incarnationism, Spinoza were just a few of the thinkers and areas that fascinated him and formed the content of his lectures. And it was this latter interest that led him to establish the Gifford Lectures. They were intended to be a major public lecture series run at the four ancient universities in Scotland, and they were aimed, and I quote, at promoting, advancing, teaching, and diffusing the study of natural theology. With only a 3-year break during World War II, the lectures have been delivered annually since their inception. It was Gifford's wish that the lectures would be public and open to the community, as in his own words, he was persuaded that nothing but good can result from free discussion. He suggested other conditions. He was keen that the Gifford lecture should change, quotes, it being desirable that the subject be promoted and illustrated by different minds. And there's no doubt that the prestige and freshness of the Gifford Lectures rests on the quality and caliber of its lecturers, who through the years have represented a wide range of important thinkers from the worlds of religion, science, and theology. And I can confidently say that Gifford would have more than approved of this year's Gifford Lecture, the distinguished academic Professor Judith Butler. And it's my very great pleasure now to introduce Dr. Ramona Fotiad of our School of Modern Languages and Culture, who's going to introduce Professor Butler.
Good afternoon, principal, students, colleagues, and guests of the university. My name is Ramona Fotiad, and I'm here to welcome you on behalf of the Gifford Lectures Committee to the first in a series of lectures hosted by the University of Glasgow this semester. Since the first lectures started in 1888, Gifford lecturers have been recognized as preeminent thinkers in their respective fields. Some of the many notable speakers to have delivered lectures include Henry Bergson, William James, Hannah Arendt, Noam Chomsky, Paul Ricoeur, Jean-Luc Marion, Iris Murdoch, Charles Taylor, Rowan Williams, and Gianni Vattimo. Today, I have the pleasure and privilege of introducing Judith Butler, who is the Maxime Elliott Professor in the Department of Comparative Literature and the Program of Critical Theory at the University of California, Berkeley. She received her PhD in philosophy from Yale University in 1984, and she is the author of numerous influential books, of which I shall mention just a few. Subjects of Desire, Hegelian Reflections in 20th Century France, published in 1987, followed by two books that established her as a leading and distinctive voice in gender studies. Gender Trouble, Feminism and the Subversion of Identity, published in 1990, and Bodies That Matter on the Discursive Limits of Sex, published in 1993. She also authored and co-authored more than 10 other volumes over the past 2 decades. For instance, The Psychic Life of Power, Theories of Subjection, published in 1997, Excitable Speech, the same year, Antigone's Claim, Kinship Between Life and Death, published in 2000, Undoing Gender in 2004, Who Sings the Nation State? Language, Politics, Belonging, with Gayatri Spivak in 2008. Is Critique Secular, co-written with Talal Assad, Wendy Brown, and Saba Mahmoud, 2009, and Sois Mon Corps, 2011, co-authored with Catherine Malabou. Her most recent books include Parting Ways, Jewishness and the Critique of Zionism, published in 2012, Dispossession, The Performative in the Political, co-authored with Athena Athanasiou in 2013, and Census of the Subject and Notes towards a Performative Theory of Assembly, published in 2015. Her books have been translated into more than 20 languages. Judith Butler is the founder and co-director of the Critical Theory program at the University of California and at Berkeley. She served as department chair of the Department of Rhetoric and as the acting chair of the Department of Gender and Women's Studies in between 2002 and 2003. She also served as the chair of the board of the University of California Humanities Research Center in Irvine. She has served on the Executive Council of the Modern Languages Association and chaired its Committee on Academic Freedom. She was the principal investigator of a 4-year grant from the Mellon Foundation to develop an international consortium of critical theory programs. Judith Butler is active in several human rights organizations, currently serving on the board of the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York and the advisory board on Jewish Voice for Peace. She was the recipient of the Andrew Mellon Award for Distinguished Academic Achievement in the Humanities. She received the Adorno Prize from the city of Frankfurt in 2012 in honor of her contributions to feminist and moral philosophy, the Brudner Prize from Yale University for lifetime achievement in gay and lesbian studies, and the Albertus Magnus Professorship from the city of Cologne, Germany, in 2016. She is as well the past recipient of several fellowships, including Guggenheim, Rockefeller, Ford, and the American Council of Learned Societies. She was fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton and the École Normale Supérieure in Paris. During her long and distinguished career, she has given the Wellek Lectures at Irvine, the Carpenter Lectures at the University of Chicago, the Watt Lecture at the Nobel Museum in Stockholm, the Gauss Lectures at Princeton, the Messenger Lectures at Cornell, the Tanner Lectures at Yale University, and the annual Freud Lecture at the Freud Museum in Vienna. As you might have guessed by now, she is one of the superstars of 1990s academia, and in any case, one of the most important and influential intellectuals of our time, whose thought has fundamentally shaped the third generation of scholarship on gender, identity, performativity, and the mechanisms of exclusion. Indeed, one cannot think of any field in the humanities whose central debates have not been altered and framed by Professor Butler's broad-ranging and engaged scholarship. From founding new fields such as queer theory to giving renewed impetus to the tradition of critical theory and political philosophy in its continental tradition. Throughout her career, she has held a number of prestigious visiting appointments, and I'll just mention a few: the Spinoza Chair in the Faculty of Philosophy at the University of Amsterdam in 2002, and most recently as a visiting professor at Columbia University in English and Comparative Literature. She has also served and serves as Hannah Arendt Professor of Philosophy at the European Graduate School in Saarfe, Switzerland. Judith Butler has also received 9 honorary degrees from universities around the globe, including University of St. Andrews, McGill University, and Université Paris 8. In 2014, she was awarded the Diploma of Chevalier of the Orders of Arts and Letters from the French Cultural Ministry. In 2015, she was elected as a corresponding fellow of the British Academy, and she's a member of the American Philosophical Society. I'd like to conclude by recalling the titles of 2 of her recent works, which stand out in regards to the topic of the Gifford Lectures starting today. Precarious Life, The Powers of Mourning and Violence, published in 2004, and Frames of War, When is Life Grievable, published in 2009. One of the reasons why Judith Butler's work has had such an avid following over the years, as witnessed by today's record turnout, is her ability to connect her philosophical concerns to pressing political issues. Since the events of September 11, Professor Butler has developed a line of thinking around the questions of violence, mourning, and precarious life, which has been at the forefront of a gradual change of perception in the current debates about alterity, conflict, solidarity, and the possibility of global justice. One critic has described Frames of War as, I quote, a book that shines with the splendor of engaged thought. And it is the courage of her commitment to the values of equality, dialogue, and responsibility in an increasingly violent world that I would like to salute at the start of one of the most eagerly anticipated public events in recent years at the University of Glasgow. This event is live streamed for 2 other audiences on campus, besides the Bute Hall, which was fully booked within days of the tickets being released, and you probably know this very well. And I'd like to thank the Bedelis and his team for the invaluable technical and logistics help in setting up the link for live streaming the full lecture series. After today's lecture, there will be 15 minutes for questions, and I'd like to invite those of you who might not get a chance to ask a question to leave a paper with your question at the reception desk downstairs upon leaving, so that Professor Butler can address some of the main points in the following lectures. But I think that if so many of us wanted to come from far and near to witness and perhaps join the debate on the value of life, it is because of the first-person question which Professor Butler invites each and everyone to ask. My life, your life, whose life matters, and where does inequality begin? So will you please join me in welcoming the most provocative gender theorist of our time, who has lent her voice to precarious lives that would otherwise remain unspeakable, a voice breaking barriers and making us realize that we are wordless without one another. Professor Butler.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for that warm and exhaustive, if not exhausting, introduction. And I thank all of you for gathering here this evening, and especially my hosts, my host committee, and the principal for welcoming me and making it possible for me to offer the Gifford lectures this year. I plan to speak to you in these 3 lectures on nonviolence, but perhaps not in the usual way. For instance, I will not be defending a principle of nonviolence that should be applied in all instances. And I will not be associating nonviolence with a calm or pacifist region of the soul. Nonviolence is not the same as passivity, even though passive forms of resistance are surely part of what is included within the range of its instances. My wager is that nonviolence becomes an ethical issue within the force field of violence itself. It's perhaps best described as a practice of resistance that becomes possible, if not mandatory, precisely at the moment when doing violence seems most justified and most obvious. In this way, nonviolence can be understood as a practice that not only stops a violent act or a violent process, but which requires a form of sustained action, sometimes aggressively pursued. So one suggestion I will make is that we can think of nonviolence not simply as the absence of violence, or the act of refraining from committing violence, but as a sustained commitment, even a way of rerouting aggression for the purposes of affirming ideals of equality and freedom. My first suggestion is that what Einstein called militant pacifism might be rethought as aggressive nonviolence. That will involve me in rethinking the relation between aggression and violence, since the two are not the same. My second suggestion, which I hope will be more fully elaborated as an argument over the next days, is that nonviolence does not make sense without a commitment to equality. The reason why nonviolence requires a commitment to equality can be understood best by considering that in this world some lives are more clearly valued than others, and that this inequality implies that certain lives will be more tenaciously defended than others. If one opposes the violence done to human lives, or indeed to other living beings as well, then that presumes that we oppose the injury done to those lives because those lives are valuable, and we oppose the killing, or indeed the letting die, of those lives because those lives are valuable. If they were to be lost as a result of violence, that loss would be registered as a loss, and that means that we regard those lives as worthy of grief. And yet, in this world, as we know, lives are not equally valued. Their claim against being injured or killed is not always registered, and one reason for this is that their lives are not considered worthy of grief or grievable. The reasons for this are many, and they include racism, xenophobia, homophobia, and transphobia, misogyny, and the systemic disregard for the poor and the dispossessed. We live in a daily way with knowledge of nameless groups of people abandoned to death on the borders of countries with closed borders, in the Mediterranean Sea, in countries where poverty and access to food and health care has become impossible. If we seek to understand what nonviolence means in this world in which we now live, we have to know the modalities of violence to be opposed. But also, we have to return to a fundamental question, a philosophical question that belongs to our time, namely, what makes a life valuable, what accounts for the unequal way that lives are valued, and how might we begin to formulate an egalitarian imaginary that would become part of our practice of nonviolence, a practice of resistance, both vigilant and hopeful. This evening, I will turn to the problem of individualism in order to foreground the importance of social bonds and interdependency for understanding a non-individualist account of equality. And I will seek to link this idea of interdependence with nonviolence. In the second of these lectures, I will begin by asking about the resources of moral philosophy for developing a reflective practice of nonviolence, and suggest that socially imbued fantasies enter into our moral reasoning on nonviolence so that we cannot always identify the demographic assumptions we make about lives that are worth valuing and those that are considered relatively or absolutely worthless. That reflection moves from Kant to Freud and Klein. In my final lecture, I will consider the ethics and politics of nonviolence in light of contemporary forms of racism and social policy, suggesting that Fanon gives us a way to understand racial phantasms that inform the ethical dimension of biopolitics, and that Walter Benjamin's idea of an open-ended civil technique of conflict resolution gives us some way to think about living with and through conflictual relations without violent conclusions. To that end, I will suggest that aggression is a component part of social bonds based on interdependency, but emphasize that aggression can be crafted and that this makes the difference for a practice that resists violence and imagines a new future of social equality. The imagination and what is imaginable will turn out to be crucial for thinking through this argument because we are, at this moment, ethically obligated and incited to think beyond what are too often treated as the realistic limits of the possible. Some representatives of the history of liberal political thought would have us believe that we emerge into this social and political world from a state of nature. You've heard the story. And in that state of nature, we are already, for some reason, individuals. And we are in conflict with one another. We're not given to understand how we became individuated, nor are we told precisely why conflict is the first of our passionate relations, rather than dependency or attachment. The Hobbesian view, which has been the most influential in shaping our understanding of political contracts, tells us that one individual wants what another has. or that both individuals lay claim to the same territory, and that they fight with one another to pursue their selfish aims and to establish their personal right to property, to nature, and to social dominance. Of course, the state of nature was always a fiction, as Rousseau openly conceded, but it has been a powerful fiction, a mode of imagining that becomes possible under conditions that Marx called political economy and later came to be understood either as property relations or indeed as capitalism. The state of nature functions in many ways. It gave us a counterfactual condition by which to assess our contemporary situation. It offered a point of view in the way that science fiction does, from which to see the specificity and contingency of the political organization of space and time, of passions and interests in the present. Writing on Rousseau, Jean Sterobensky opined that the state of nature provided an imaginary framework in which there is only one individual in the scene, self-sufficient, without dependency, saturated in self-love, yet without any need for another. Indeed, where there are no persons to speak of, there is no problem of equality. But once other living human creatures enter the scene, the problem of equality and conflict immediately emerge. Why is that the case? Well, Marx criticized that part of the state of nature hypothesis that posits the individual as primary in his 1844 manuscripts when, with great irony, he ridiculed the notion that in the beginning humans are, like Robinson Crusoe, alone on an island, providing for their own sustenance, living without dependency on others, without systems of labor, and without any common organization of political and economic life. Marx writes, and I quote, "Let us not put ourselves in that fictitious primordial state like a political economist trying to clarify things. It merely pushes the issue into a gray, misty distance. We proceed from a present fact of political economy," end quote. Marx thought he could discard fiction in favor of present fact, but that didn't stop him from making use of those very fictions to develop his critique of political economy. They do not represent reality, but if we know how to read such fictions, they yield a commentary on present reality that we otherwise might not achieve. One enters the fiction in order to discern the structure, but also to ask what can and cannot be figured here, what can be imagined, and through what terms. For instance, that lonely and sufficient figure of Robinson Crusoe was invariably an adult and a man. The first figure of the natural man, the one whose self-sufficiency is eventually interrupted by the demands of social and economic life, but not as a consequence of his natural condition. Indeed, when others enter the scene, conflict begins, or so the story goes. So, in the beginning, temporally considered, and most fundamentally, ontologically considered, individuals pursue their selfish interests. They clash and fight. But conflict becomes arbitrated only in the midst of a regulated sociality. Each individual would presumably, prior to entering the social contract, seek to pursue and satisfy his wants regardless of its effects on others and without any expectation of resolution, indeed without resolving those competing or clashing desires. The contract emerges, according to this fiction, first and foremost as a means of conflict resolution. Each individual must restrict one's desires, put limits on their capacity to consume, to take, and to act in order to live according to commonly binding laws. For Hobbes, those laws become the common power by which human nature is restrained. The state of nature was not exactly an ideal, and Hobbes did not call for a return to that state, as Rousseau sometimes did. For he imagined that lives would be cut short, that murder would be unrestrained if there were no common government and no binding set of laws to subdue the conflictual character of human nature. The state of nature was, for him, a war, but not a war among states or existing authorities. but a war waged by one sovereign individual against another, a war, we might add, of individuals who regard themselves as sovereign. For it's unclear whether that sovereignty belongs to an individual conceived of as separate from the state, who transfers his own sovereignty to the state. That's how we see it if we move from the state of nature to the social contract, or the covenant in Hobbes's terms. But we could ask whether, in fact, the state is already there as the horizon of this imaginary, of this idea of the state of nature. Let's be clear, the state of nature is not one thing. It differs in Locke, Rousseau, and Hobbes, and even within Hobbes's Leviathan, there are arguably at least 5 versions. The state of nature can postulate a time before society. It can seek to describe foreign civilizations that are assumed to be pre-modern. It can offer a political psychology that accounts for civil strife. It can describe political power dynamics within 17th century Europe. I'm not exactly conducting a scholarly review, but I want to consider how the state of nature becomes the occasion for a certain kind of imagining, if not a fantasy, or what Rousseau calls a pure fiction, one that is centrally concerned with violent conflict and its resolution. As such, we can ask, under what historical conditions do such fantasies or fictions take hold? They become possible and persuasive from within a condition of social conflict or as a consequence of its history. They represent, perhaps, the dream of an escape from the sufferings associated with the capitalist organization of work, or they function as a justification for that very organization. They articulate and comment upon the arguments for strengthening state power and its instruments of violence to cultivate or contain the popular will. They emerge in our understanding of populism, the condition in which the popular will is imagined to assume an unconstrained form. They encode and reproduce forms of domination and exploitation that set classes and religious or racial groups against one another, as if something called tribalism was a primitive or natural condition that rears up and explodes if states fail to exercise their restraining powers. That is, if states fail to impose their own violence, including legal violence. If we understand the state of nature as a fiction or a fantasy, and the two are not the same, as I hope to discuss, then what set of wishes or desires does it represent or articulate? I suggest that these wishes belong neither simply to the individual nor to an autonomous psychic life, but maintain a critical relation to the social and economic conditions upon which they comment. The state of nature can function as an inverted picture, a critical commentary, a justification, or a ruthless critique. What is posited as an origin or an original condition is retrospectively imagined, and so posited as the result of a sequence that begins in the already constituted social world. And yet there is a yearning to posit a foundation, an imaginary origin, as a way of accounting for this world, or perhaps of escaping its pain and alienation. This train of thought could easily lead us down a psychoanalytic path if we were to take seriously the idea that a fantasy functions as a foundation for human life in its social aspects. This may well be true. My desire is not to replace fantasy with reality, but rather to learn how to understand fantasy as yielding key insights into the structure and dynamic of historically constituted organizations of power and violence as they relate to life and death. Indeed, I myself will not be able to offer a critical rejoinder to this notion of a man without needs at the origin of social life without engaging a fantasy of my own, one that does not start with me, but takes me up into its terms, articulating, as it were, the syntax of the social through a different imaginary. One rather remarkable feature of this state of nature fantasy, which is regularly invoked as a foundation, is that in the beginning, apparently, there is a man and he is adult and he is on his own self-sufficient. So let's take notice that this story begins not at the beginning, but in the middle of a history that is not about to be told. With the opening moment of the story, with the moment that marks the beginning, gender, for instance, has been already decided. Independence and dependency have been separated. The masculine and feminine are determined in part in relation to this distribution of dependency. The primary and founding figure of the human is masculine. That comes as no great surprise. Masculinity, though, is defined by its lack of dependency, and although that is not exactly news, it continues somehow to be quite startling. What does seem interesting, and it is as true for Hobbes as it is for Marx, is that the human is from the start an adult man. In other words, the individual who is introduced to us as the first moment of the human, the outbreak of the human onto the world, as it were, is posited as if he were never a child, was never provided for, never depended upon parents or kinship relations or social institutions to survive and grow and presumably learn. That individual has already been cast as a gender, but not by social assignment. And because he is an individual and the social form of the individual is masculine in this scene, he is a man. So if we wish to understand this fantasy, we have to ask what version of the human and what version of gender it represents and what occlusions are required for that representation to work. Dependency is, as it were, written out of the picture of the original man. He is somehow and from the start always and already upright, capable, without ever having been supported by others, without having held onto another's body in order to steady himself, without ever having been fed when he could not feed himself, without ever having been wrapped in a blanket for warmth by someone else. He sprang, lucky guy, from the imagination of liberal theorists as a full adult, without relations, equipped with anger and desire, sometimes capable of happiness or some mode of self-sufficiency that depended on a natural world, preemptively void of other people and malleable to his will. Shall we then concede that an annihilation has taken place prior to the scene that is narrated, and that an annihilation inaugurates the scene? Everyone else is excluded, negated, and from the start. Is that perhaps an inaugural violence? It is not a tabula rasa, but rather a slate wiped clean. And so, too, is the prehistory of the so-called state of nature, since the state of nature is supposed to be, in one of its most influential variants, a prehistory of social and economic life. The annihilation of alterity constitutes the prehistory of this prehistory, suggesting that we are not only elaborating a fantasy, but giving a history of that very fantasy, arguably a murder or an obliteration that leaves no trace. The social contract, as many feminist theorists have argued, Carol Pateman among them, is already a sexual contract. But even before women enter the picture, there is only this individual man. There is, yes, somewhere a woman in the scene, but she does not take form as a figure. We cannot even fault the representation of women in the scene because she is, at least at the beginning, unrepresentable. An expulsion of some sort has taken place. In its place is erected the adult man. He's assumed to desire women in the course of things, but even this postulated heterosexuality is free of dependency and rests on a cultivated amnesia regarding his formation. He is understood to encounter others first, only in a conflictual way. Why bother with this influential fantasy in political theory? After all, my topic is the ethics and politics of nonviolence. I'm not actually going to argue against the primary character of conflictual relations. In fact, I will insist that conflict is a potential part of every social bond, and that Hobbes is not altogether wrong. Indeed, Freud harbors a Hobbesian thesis when he challenges the biblical commandment to honor thy neighbor and not covet his wife. For why, Freud asks, should we not assume that enmity and hostility are more fundamental than love? My own thesis, which will arrive a bit later, is that if nonviolence is to make sense as an ethical and political position, it cannot simply repress aggression or do away with its reality. Rather, nonviolence emerges as a meaningful concept precisely when destruction is most likely or seems most certain. When destruction becomes the ardent aim of desire but is nevertheless checked, what accounts for that check? That imposition of a limit and a displacement. From where does it come? What lets it take hold and be maintained? Some would say that the check on violence is always a form of self-checking. It's the superego that checks the externalization of aggression, even as the superego is the name we have for the process of absorbing aggression into the architecture of the psyche itself. The economy of the superego is a moralism whereby aggression unleashes itself against itself and the psychic life that bears it. It denounces violence, and the denunciation becomes a new form of violence in the course of things. Others would say that this check on violence can only be applied from the outside, by law, by government, even the police. That is the more properly Hobbesian view. The coercive power of the state is necessary to contain the potentially murderous rage of its unruly subjects. Others claim that there's a calm or pacific region of the soul, and that we must cultivate the capacity to dwell, always there, subduing aggression and destructiveness through religious or ethical practices and rituals. But as I mentioned, Einstein argued in favor of a militant pacifism, and perhaps now we can ourselves talk about an aggressive form of nonviolence. To do this within the time I have, I propose that we think first about an ethics of nonviolence that presupposes forms of dependency and interdependency that are unmanageable or become the source of conflict and aggression. Second, I propose that we consider how our understanding of equality relates to the ethics and politics of nonviolence. And for that connection to make sense, we have to admit into our idea of political equality the equal grievability of lives. Only a disorientation from a presumptive individualism will let us understand the possibility of an aggressive nonviolence, one that emerges in the midst of conflict, one that takes hold in the force field of violence itself. That means that equality is not only the equality of individuals with one another, but a concept that first becomes thinkable once we wage a critique of individualism itself. Okay, let us then try a different story. It begins this way. Every individual emerges in the course of the process of individuation. No one is born an individual. If someone becomes an individual over time, he, she, they do not escape the fundamental conditions of dependency in the course of that process. That condition cannot be escaped in time. We are, all of us in this room, regardless of our political viewpoints in the present, born into a condition of radical dependency. As we reflect back on that condition as adults, we are perhaps slightly insulted or alarmed, or perhaps dismiss the thought, or even come to hate the person who reminds us about such topics. Perhaps someone with a strong sense of individual self-sufficiency will indeed be offended by the fact that there was a time when one could not feed oneself or could not stand on one's own, and many of us still need support to stand, indeed support to eat. But in fact, I want to suggest no one actually does stand on one's own. Strictly speaking, no one feeds oneself. Disability studies has shown us that in order to move along the street, there must be pavements that allow for movement, especially if one only moves with a chair or with an instrument for support. The pavement is also an instrument of support, as are the traffic lights and the curb stops when they exist. It's not only those of us who are disabled who require support in order to move, to be fed, or indeed to breathe. All of these basic human capacities are supported in one way or another. No one moves or breathes or finds food who is not supported by a world that provides an environment built for passage, that prepares and distributes food so that it makes its way to our mouths, a world that sustains the environment that makes possible the kind of air that we can breathe. Dependency can be defined partly as a dependency on social and material structures, but also on the environment, all of which make life possible. Regardless of our quarrels with psychoanalysis, and everyone has a quarrel, I presume, for that is what psychoanalysis is, a theory and practice with which people quarrel. Indeed, there is no psychoanalysis without a quarrel with psychoanalysis. Perhaps we can say that we do not overcome the dependency of infancy when we become adults. That does not mean that the adult is dependent in the exact same way the infant is. It only means that we are creatures who constantly imagine a self-sufficiency only to find that image of ourselves undermined repeatedly in the course of life. This is, of course, a Lacanian position, articulated most famously by the mirror stage, the jubilant boy who thinks he stands on his own as he looks in the mirror, and yet watching him we know that the mother or some obscured object support, what is called a trotte-bébé, holds him in front of the mirror as he rejoices in his radical self-sufficiency. Perhaps we can say that the founding conceits of liberal individualism are a kind of mirror stage, that they take place within an imaginary of this kind. What supports, what dependency has to be disavowed for the fantasy of self-sufficiency to take hold, for the story to start with a timeless adult masculinity. The implication of this scene, of course, is that it would seem that masculinity is identified with a phantasmatic self-sufficiency, and femininity is identified with the support provided for him, a support that is regularly disavowed or occluded. This picture and story lock us into an economy of gender relations that hardly serves us. Heterosexuality becomes the presumptive frame, and it is derived from the theory of mother and child, which is but one way of imagining the relations of support for the child. The gendered structure of the family is taken for granted, including, of course, the obscuring of the mother's labor of care and the full absence of the father. And if we accept all this as the symbolic structure of things rather than a specific imaginary, we accept the operation of a law that can only be changed incrementally and over a very long period of time. But the theory that describes this fantasy, this asymmetry, this scene, including the gender division of labor, can end up reproducing and validating its terms unless it shows us another way out, unless it asks about the scene prior to or outside this scene, the moment, as it were, before the beginning. So let us move, as it were, from dependency to interdependency and see how that alters our understanding of vulnerability, conflict, adulthood, sociality, violence, and politics. I ask this question because at both a political and economic level, the facts of global interdependency are sometimes systematically and sometimes periodically denied, or they are exploited. Of course, advertisements for corporations celebrate a globalized world, but that idea of corporate expansion captures only one sense of globalization, and that one is linked to increasing conditions of precarity. National sovereignty may be waning, and yet new nationalisms insist upon that frame. So one reason it is so difficult to convince a government such as my own that global warming is a real threat to the future of the livable world, is that their rights to expand production, profit, and markets, to exploit nature, remain centered on augmenting a national wealth and power. Perhaps they do not conceive of the possibility that what they do affects all regions of the world, and that what happens in all regions of the world affects the very possibility of the continuation of a livable environment, one on which we all depend. Or perhaps they do see that, and they know they are engaging in globally destructive activity, and that too seems like a right, a power, a prerogative that should be compromised by nothing and by no one. We'll have to think a little later about the right to destroy, how that gets invoked and why. The idea of global obligations that serves all inhabitants of the world, human and animal, is about as far from the neoliberal consecration of individualism as it could be, and yet it is regularly dismissed as naive. So I am summoning my courage to expose my naivete, my fantasy, my counter-fantasy, if you will. Some people ask in more or less incredulous tones, how can you believe in global obligations? That is surely naive. But when I ask, do you want to live in a world where no one was arguing for global obligations, they usually say no. Okay. I also believe that this emphasis on global obligations is in the spirit of the Gifford lectures, by the way. So I want to argue that only by avowing this interdependency does it become possible to formulate global obligations, including obligations toward the migrants, the Roma, those who live in precarious situations, or indeed those who are subject to occupation and war, those who are subject to institutional and systemic racism, women who are subject to domestic and public violence, harassment in the workplace, and gender nonconforming people who are exposed to bodily harm, including incarceration and death. I want to suggest as well that a new idea of equality can emerge only from a more fully imagined interdependency, an imagining that unfolds in practices and institutions, in new forms of civic and political life. Oddly enough, equality imagined in this way would not be, strictly speaking, an equality among individuals. Of course, it's good that one person is treated as equal to another. I'm all in favor of anti-discrimination law, don't get me wrong. But that formulation, as important as it is, does not tell us by virtue of what set of interrelationships social and political equality first becomes thinkable. When equality is understood as an individual right, I have a right to be treated equally or in the same way as someone else, on the assumption that someone else is being treated well, it is separated from the social obligations we bear toward one another. To formulate equality on the basis of the relations that define our enduring social existence, that define us as social living creatures, is to make a collective claim on society, if not a claim to the social as the framework within which our imaginings of equality, freedom, and nonviolence take form and make sense. Whatever claims of equality are then formulated emerge from relations between or among people in the name of those relations and those bonds, but not, strictly speaking, of an individual subject. Equality is thus a feature of social relations defined in part by an increasingly avowed interdependency. I have argued elsewhere that vulnerability should not be considered as a subjective state, but rather as a feature of our shared and interdependent lives. We are never simply vulnerable. Vulnerability is not a kind of steady state of a subject. It's rather that we are always vulnerable to a situation, a person, a social structure, something upon which we rely and in relation to which we are exposed. Perhaps we can say that we are vulnerable to those environmental and social structures that make our lives possible, and when they falter, so do we. To be dependent implies vulnerability. One is vulnerable to the social structure upon which one depends. If the structure fails, one is exposed to a precarious condition. But if that is so, we're not talking about my vulnerability or yours, but rather a feature of the relation that binds us to one another and to the larger structures and institutions upon which we depend for the continuation of life. Vulnerability is not exactly the same as dependency. I depend on someone, something, or some condition in order to live. But when that person disappears, or that object is withdrawn, or that social institution falls apart, I become vulnerable to dispossession, abandonment, or exposure in ways that may well prove not to be livable. The relational understanding of vulnerability shows that we are not altogether separable from the conditions that make our lives possible. In other words, we are never fully individuated. One implication of this view is that the obligations that bind us to one another follow from the condition of interdependency that makes our lives possible. The political organization of life itself requires interdependency, and the equality it implies is acknowledged through policy institutions, civil society, and government. If we accept, and indeed transnational structures, if we accept the proposal that there are or must be global obligations that are globally shared and ought to be considered binding, they cannot be reduced to obligations that nation states have toward one another. They would have to be post-national in character, traversing borders and navigating their terms. Since populations at the border or crossing the border, stateless people, refugees, are those included in the larger network of interrelationships implied by global obligations. So I've been arguing that the task, as I imagined it, is not to overcome dependency in order to achieve self-sufficiency, but rather to accept interdependency as a condition of equality. That formulation meets with an immediate and important challenge. After all, there are forms of colonial power that seek to establish the so-called dependency of the colonized. And these kinds of arguments seek to make dependency an essential and pathological feature of populations who have been colonized. They are colonized because they are dependent. Their dependency is not a consequence of colonization. That deployment of dependency confirms both racism and colonialism. It identifies the cause of a group's subordination as a psychosocial feature of the group itself. The colonizer, as Albert Memmi has argued, understands himself as the adult in the scene, the one who can bring a colonized population out of their childlike dependency and into an enlightened adulthood. We find this figure of the colonized as the child in Kant's famous essay, What is Enlightenment? But the truth is that the colonizer depends upon the colonized, for when the colonized refuse to remain subordinate, then the colonizer is threatened with the loss of colonial power. Of course, it looks good to overcome dependency if one has been made dependent on a colonial structure, or made dependent on an unjust state, or an exploitative marriage or labor contract. Breaking with those forms of dependency can be part of the process of emancipation, of claiming both equality and freedom. But which version of equality do we then accept, and which version of freedom? If we break the ties of dependency in an effort to overcome exploitation, does that mean that we now value independence? Well, yes, it does. But if that independence becomes a mode of breaking ties with those forms of interdependency that we value and that we require, what then follows? If independence returns us to the sovereignty of the individual or the nation state in such a way that post-sovereign understandings of cohabitation and interrelationality become unthinkable, then we've returned to a version of self-sufficiency that implies endless conflict. After all, it is only from a renewed and revalued notion of interdependency among regions and hemispheres that we can begin to think about the threat to the environment, the problem of the global slum, systemic racism, the condition of stateless people whose migration is a common global responsibility, even the more thorough overcoming of colonial modes of power depends on such an imagining. So far, I've been moving between a psychoanalytic and social understanding of interdependency, laying the groundwork for a practice of nonviolence within a new egalitarian imaginary. These levels of analysis have to be brought together without using the psychoanalytic framework as a model for all social relations. The critique of ego psychology does give a social meaning to psychoanalysis that links it with a broader consideration of the conditions of sustenance and persistence, question central to any conception of the biopolitical. My counter-thesis to the state of nature hypothesis is that nobody can sustain oneself on one's own. The body is not and never was a self-subsisting kind of being, which is but one reason why the metaphysics of substance was never a particularly good frame for understanding what a body is. The body is given over to others in order to persist. Does metaphysics have a way to conceptualize this vital paradox? As interpersonal as this relation may sound, it is also socially organized in a broader sense, pointing as it does to the social organization of life. We all start with having been given over. That's what happens when a child is born. Someone gives the child over to someone else if that child is not radically abandoned. We are from the start handled against our will. Even poor Oedipus, although that was a nearly fatal act, since his mother handed him over to someone who was supposed to kill him. Being handed over is not always a beautiful scene. Okay. The infant is given over by someone to someone else, and the caregiver is in some ways given over to the task of care, and sometimes quite emphatically prior to any act of will. Care is not always consensual. We know it's not always paid for. It can be a way of getting wrecked time and again by the demands of a wailing and hungry creature. But there is here a larger claim that does not rely on any particular account of the social organization of motherhood or caregiving. Our enduring dependency on social and economic forms of life is not something we ever grow out of. It's not a dependency that converts to independence in time. When there is nothing to depend upon, when social structures fail or are withdrawn, then life itself fails. Life becomes precarious. That enduring condition may become more poignant in childcare and care for the elderly or for those who are physically challenged. But there are no exceptions to this general formulation. Well, what does it mean to be given over? Does it imply that we are also those to whom someone or some number of people are also given over? Are we at once given over and those to whom others are given over, a kind of asymmetry for each that is nevertheless a reciprocity when regarded as a social relation? When the world fails us, when we ourselves become worldless in the social sense, then the body suffers and shows its precarity, and that mode of demonstrating precarity is itself, or carries with it, a political demand and even an expression of outrage. To be a body differentially exposed to harm or to death is precisely to exhibit a form of precarity, but also to suffer a form of inequality that is manifestly unjust. So the situation of so many populations, increasingly subject to unlivable precarity, raises for us the question of global obligations. If we ask, why should any of us care about those who suffer at a distance from us, the answer is not to be found in paternalistic justifications, but in the fact that we inhabit the world together in relations of interdependency. Our fates are, as it were, given over to one another. So we have moved from the Robinson Crusoe figure with which we began. The embodied subject is, as I'm hoping to define it, is marked by its lack of self-sufficiency from the start, and this also gives us some indication of how longing, desire, rage, and anxiety all figure in this scene, especially under conditions when exposure becomes unbearable or dependency becomes unmanageable. Suffering those conditions can lead to understandable rage, to anger, even to violence. Under what conditions does interdependency become a scene of aggression, conflict, and violence? How do we understand the destructive potential of this social bond? Interdependency raises that question of the destructiveness that is a potential part of any living relation, one that can rupture relationality intermittently or permanently, one that is the rupture potentially at work in all social relations. If our ethical and political practices remain restricted to an individual mode of life or decision-making, or indeed to a virtue ethics that reflects on who we are as individuals, we risk losing sight of that interdependency that establishes an embodied social and relational version of equality, as well as the possibility of destructiveness and the ethical obligations by which it is restrained or rerouted. What difference to our thinking would such a framework imply? Well, most forms of violence are committed to inequality, whether or not that commitment is explicitly thematized. And the way the decision is framed, whether or not to use violence on any given occasion, makes a number of assumptions about those with regard to whom violence is to be waged or not. For instance, it's not possible to comply with an interdiction against violence if the living creature that is not to be killed cannot be named or known. If the person, the group, the population is not considered already living and alive, how is the command not to kill them to be understood? That command makes sense only if we assume that those who we are considering are living and that they can be named as such and safeguarded by an interdiction against violence. If the interdiction against killing rests on the presumption that all lives are valuable, that they bear value as lives in their status as living beings, then the universality of the claim is good only on the condition that value extends equally to all living beings. This means that we have to think not only about persons, but animals, and not only about living creatures, but living processes, the systems and form of life. There is a further point. A life has to be grievable. That is, its loss has to be conceptualizable as a loss. For an interdiction against violence and destruction to include that life among those living beings to be safeguarded from violence. The condition under which some lives are more grievable than others means that this condition of equality has not been met. The consequence is that a prohibition against killing applies only to those lives that are grievable, but not to those who are considered ungrievable, since those are the ones who are already lost or were never fully alive or don't really count as subjects within this ethical calculus. The differential distribution of grievable lives has to be addressed if an ethics of nonviolence is to work on the assumption of the equal value of lives. The unequal distribution of grievability might be one framework for understanding the differential production of humans and other creatures within a structure of inequality, or indeed within a structure of violent disavowal. Moral philosophers and theologians have asked what grounds the claim that interdiction against killing is wrong? Well, the usual ways of handling this question, or the usual ways to ask whether that interdiction, commandment, or prohibition is absolute, whether it has a theological or a conventional status, whether it is a matter of law or morality. It is also invariably accompanied by a further question, namely, whether there are bona fide exceptions to such an interdiction when injuring or even killing is justified. And then debates tend to unfold about what, if any, exceptions exist and what they indicate about the less than absolute character of that interdiction. It's at this juncture that self-defense usually enters the picture. The exception to the rule is important, perhaps more important than the rule itself. For instance, if there are exceptions to the prohibition on killing, and if there are always such exceptions, that suggests that the prohibition against killing is less than absolute. It's a prohibition that on occasion fails to assert itself, or holds itself back, or suspends its own powers of restraint. Self-defense is a highly ambiguous term, as we can see in militaristic modes of foreign policy that justify every attack as self-defense. And in the contemporary US, we now have laws that make provisions for what is called preemptive killing. If you imagine someone is coming at you, you may kill first. At least police are given that right. In practice, this extends to the defense of loved ones, right? My self-defense, children or animals or others who are considered close to you, relations that are part of one's broader sense of self. It therefore makes sense to ask what defines and limits those relations, what elaborates the conception of self to include groups of others in this way, and why they are usually understood as biological relatives or those related through conjugal ties, right? So someone says to me, I am a pacifist, but I will commit violence in the name of self-defense. And I ask, this is true, by the way, well, would you defend your daughter? Well, yeah, of course I would defend my daughter. Okay, so it's you and your daughter. Would you defend your brother? Yes, of course I would defend my brother. Okay. And what about your Uncle Tony? Well, Uncle Tony hasn't always been good to me. Right. So there's a line, right? But what makes the line, right? It's like those who are, these people are part of me. I defend them as I would defend myself. But then others, well, I don't know. But what about that other group of people? I don't speak their language, right? I've never met them. Okay. So one question is what or who is part of the self that you are and what relations are included under the rubric of the self, which is justified in defending itself. Are we perhaps more ethically obligated to preserve the lives of those who are close to us or like us than those who are far away or appear to be dissimilar? If I defend myself and those who are considered part of myself are proximate enough so that I know and love them, then this self that I am is, yes, relational, but the relations are delimited by belonging to my proximate sphere. So one's justified in using violence to defend those who belong to this broader region of myself, but maybe not the others. Some group is covered by my expanded claims of self-defense. They're understood to be worthy of a violent protection against violence, a violence done to others so that it's not done to one's own. The interdiction against violence reemerges within the exception. Now it is that group composed of those who are not part of my region of the self who threaten my group with violence or against those I'm apparently justified in waging violence. Or there is some group I don't understand and I can't possibly be asked to intervene on their behalf. The interdiction now is imposed on the other group, the one that is not my own, not to engage in violent acts. Absent that operative interdiction, I or we are justified in killing. Further, when we get to that point in which oneself or one's group violently defends what it takes to be itself against violence, not only is there a rather large and consequential exception made to the interdiction against violence, but the distinction between the force of the interdiction and the violence interdicted starts to collapse. The exception to the interdiction opens up onto a situation of war in which it's right to defend oneself or one's own violently and in the name of self-defense, but certainly not a whole host of others who don't belong to oneself. That means there are always those whose lives I do not defend and I do not value, and there will always be those who seek to do violence to those whose lives are intricately bound up with my own, part of my extended region of the self, which would include those others I recognize as having a binding ethical claim upon me. At such moments, the interdiction against violence, again, proves itself to be less than absolute, and the exception to the interdiction becomes a potential state of war, or at least coextensive with its logic. Since if one will kill for this or that person who is proximate and affiliated, what finally distinguishes the proximate from those who live at a distance? And under what conditions could that distinction be regarded as ethically justifiable in distinguishing between the value of lives? Now, of course, and I'm moving towards the end of my remarks here, international human rights interventionists and what we call hawks in the United States would argue that what follows is we, especially in the first world, should paternalistically always be prepared to go to war for everyone. That's not exactly what my government is doing now, but we did do that in the past. But my point is decidedly different. The exceptions to the norm of nonviolence actually begin to elaborate forms of group identification, even nationalism, that result in a certain war logic. It goes like this: I defend those who are like me or who might be understood as part of my region of the self, but not those who are unlike me. And that converts rather easily into the claim I will defend only those who are like me or recognizable to me, but will defend against those who are not recognizable to me and with whom no ties of belonging seem to exist. Now, with those examples, I wish to pose the question of whether there's a norm that is invoked to distinguish those who belong to the group whose lives are worth living and those who do not belong to that group and whose lives are not worth living or indeed defending. For implicit in the way the exception to the interdiction against violence works is that there are those who are understood to belong and to deserve protection against violence, whereas there are those who do not belong. Well, in relation to them, I invoke my principle of nonviolence and I do not intervene on their behalf. Although that may sound cynical, the point is meant only to foreground the fact that some of our moral principles may well be already in the sway of other political interests and frameworks. The distinction between populations that are worth violently defending and those who are not implies that some lives are simply considered more valuable than others. So my suggestion was to consider that the principle by which conditions under which the exception to nonviolence are identified is at once a measure for distinguishing among populations those one is ready to grieve or do not qualify as grievable, and those one is prepared to grieve and whose death ought in all instances to be forestalled. So if we make exceptions to the principle of nonviolence, it shows that we're ready to fight harm, maybe even murder, and that we're prepared to give moral reasons for doing so. And according to this logic, one does this either in self-defense or in defense of those who belong to one's broader sense of self, with whom identification possible. And if that last proposition is true, then there's a moral justification for violence that emerges precisely on a demographic basis, that is, on the grounds of distinguishing among the value of different populations. So I'm suggesting that what started in my final section here as a moral framework for understanding the interdiction against violence, its presuppositions, and its exceptions, has turned into a different kind of problem, a political problem. In the first instance, the norm we invoke to distinguish those lives we're willing to defend and those that are considered dispensable is part of a larger operation of biopower that unjustifiably distinguishes between grievable and ungrievable lives. But if we accept the notion that all lives are equally grievable and that the political world ought rightly to be organized in such a way that this principle is affirmed and reflected in the organization of economic and institutional life, then we arrive at a different conclusion and perhaps even another way to approach the problem of nonviolence. After all, if a life from the start is regarded as grievable, then every effort will be taken to safeguard that life or to support that life, minimizing the probability of harm and destruction. What we might call the radical equality of the grievable is what has to be the demographic precondition for an ethics of nonviolence that does not make the exception. This leads me to my final point. Oh, 807, okay. This brings me to my final point. The ethical stand of nonviolence has to be linked to a commitment to radical equality. And more specifically, the practice of nonviolence requires an opposition to biopolitical forms of racism and war logics that regularly distinguish between lives worth safeguarding and those that are not. For instance, collateral damage or populations conceived as obstructions to policy and military aims and therefore dispensable. Further, we have to consider how a tacit war logic enters into the biopolitical management of populations. If migrants come, they will destroy us, or they will destroy culture, or they will destroy Europe or the UK. This conviction then licenses violent destruction, or the slower death in life of detention camps. And it's directed against a population that is phantasmatically construed as the locus of destruction. According to that war logic, it is a matter of the lives of refugees or of the lives of those who claim to have the right to be defended against the refugees. Racist and paranoid versions of self-defense authorize the destruction of another population. The ethical and political practice of nonviolence can rely neither exclusively on the dyadic encounter, nor on the bolstering of a prohibition. It requires rather a political opposition to biopolitical forms of racism and war logics that rely on phantasmagoric inversions that occlude the binding and interdependent character of our social relations. It requires as well an account of why and under what conditions the frameworks for understanding violence and nonviolence, or violence and self-defense, seem to invert into one another, causing confusion about how best to pin down those terms. Why, for instance, is a petition for peace in Turkey called a violent act? Why is a human barricade thwarting the police sometimes called an act of violent aggression? Under what conditions and within which frameworks does the inversion of violence and nonviolence occur? There is no way to practice nonviolence without first interpreting violence and nonviolence, especially in a world in which violence is increasingly justified in the name of security, nationalism, and neo-fascism. The state monopolizes its violence by calling its critics violent. We know this from Gramsci and from Benjamin. Hence, we should be wary about those who claim that violence is necessary to curb or check violence, those who praise the force of law, including the police and the prisons, as final arbiters. To oppose violence is to understand that violence does not always take the form of the blow. The institutional forms through which it operates compel us to ask whose life appears as a life, whose loss would register as a loss. How does the demographic imaginary function in ethics, policy, and politics? If we operate within the horizon in which violence cannot be identified, where lives vanish from the realm of the living before they are killed, we will not be able to think, to know, and to act in ways that embed the political in the ethical, that understand the claim of relational obligations within the global sphere. We have to break open the horizon of this everyday in which so many inequalities and effacements inform our policies. I doubt that we need a state of nature, but we do need an altered state of perception, a disorientation without which we will not find our way toward an ethical and political life in which aggression and sorrow do not immediately convert into violence, in which we might be able to endure the difficulty of social bonds we never chose and the importance of a persistence that is relational, fragile, sometimes unbearable, always necessary. Many people say arguing for nonviolence is unrealistic, but perhaps they are too enamored with reality. When I ask, do you want to live in a world in which no one was arguing for nonviolence, where no one held out for that impossibility, people generally say no. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for extremely thought-provoking first lecture. I'm sure you have many questions. We have 15 minutes or so for questions. So there are microphones going out to people in the audience.
Thank you for the lecture. I was wondering if you are aware of the 3 British men who were recently jailed using non-violent means to protest fracking, and if you have any thoughts on this case?
No, you'd have to tell me about that case.
Yeah, it was Simon Roscoe Blevins, Richard Roberts, and Rich Loiseau, who protested against fracking. When was this? In Lancashire. And they've been given a 12-month prison term. And lots of academics have come out now in protest against this.
Can you tell me what the nature of his protest was?
So,
what form was that? What form did that take?
For instance, climbing onto a lorry with a anti-fracking sign.
Yes.
Yeah, they're the first environmental protesters to receive a jail sentence in the UK since 1932.
I see. Sounds like it's something I should look into. I think in general there's a question about an increasing criminalization of protest, that the invocation of security or property over the right to free expression or political expression is happening not just in several regions of the world, but also on university campuses to a large degree. And I think we see this, I don't know what the rationale was in that case, but I would be interested to know whether it had to do with a certain idea of security, or whether it was understood as violence against property. I'll take a closer look.
Thank you for that wonderful talk. So I have a question about the notion of colonization of time. So in your discussion, you talked about reflecting back and recognizing the origins of where we are in the present, but I was thinking about our obligations to future generations. So could you link this issue to that notion that we have an obligation to future generations? It could be, in fact, in an environmental sense, the right of future generations to a healthful environment, our exploitation of resources in the present, where we pay no heed to perhaps future generations' rights. So could you perhaps link this to that other
you've just
dimension?
done a beautiful job linking it. So I'm very grateful to you. Of course, that's right. I mean, I think perhaps that does need to be brought out. But you know, there are 2 senses of futurity that I would underscore. On the one hand, what I'm trying to bring attention to is the conditions of livable life, the conditions under which we might cohabit the world together. And it's not just for a presently constituted population of the earth, but it is for a future population. Sometimes we think of that as generational, but I would like to think about future populations not necessarily as generations, and I'm not sure exactly why, but I worry that it requires a certain idea of the family as the key to futurity. I'm not against the future, as some of my fellow queer theorists are, but I want to make sure we try to think the future in ways that don't take for granted the reproductive mechanism through which, or the reproductive structure through which future peoples emerge. And that's controversial, and it's another topic. But I wanted to say this, that under contemporary conditions, and I didn't talk really about neoliberalism, I went back to classical liberalism, but under conditions in which there's so much debt, or when work is so contingent and so insecure, when many people have been dispossessed of homes or where healthcare is no longer possible, I think the whole idea of a future horizon has closed. So there's also that sense of futurity that I think needs to be safeguarded. But the idea of having a sustainable environment and a broad politics and ethics in relationship to global warming and forms of environmental toxicity or environmental racism in particular, all of that does orient itself towards the production of a mode of life that would make it possible for people to continue to live and inhabit the earth, not just for ourselves. So I do think that that's a crucial perspective, and I appreciate you raising it.
Hello, Professor Butler. Thank you so much for your lecture. I had a question about what constitutes life. So it seems to me before we can begin our discussion of the equality of life, we should lay some groundwork about what constitutes life. So I'd actually like to pose or avoid the metaphysics of what constitutes life and ask you specifically, when is human life constituted and why?
Well, it's constituted in society, right? That is my answer. And we have lots of imaginings from within society about how then it gets constituted. And there are lots of processes that make that possible. But I also think that I am not interested in coming up with like a typology. Here's human life, here's animal life, here's environmental living processes or the biosphere or some such. I'm much more interested in what would happen if we begin with the relational framework or the interdependent framework. And if that becomes the framework, how do these types of life, including human life, become defined in relationship to these other modalities? And that's a shift from trying to define and secure a typology along an Aristotelian line and to trying to understand a much more broad relational framework. I mean, I don't know whether you're asking me to take a stand on so-called right to life or the question of the fetus or when does human life start in terms of conception and that question. But if you want me to do that, I have to write you another lecture. And I'm happy to do that, but I'm not sure I can do it right now. I take it as a very serious question, if that is the question. It's a very serious question. But well, we would have to go before the beginning as well. We would have to go to the reproductive, the sexual act that produces the condition of pregnancy. Who's living that? Under what conditions? What are the economic conditions? What are the social conditions? So the beginning has another beginning.
Short one.
Sorry, I'm being very leisurely.
Thank you very much. That was indeed a very interesting lecture. And
Can't see the person.
is this okay?
Yes, I just can't
Okay.
see you.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Right. That was indeed a most interesting lecture. I thought the way you integrated some quite diverse ideas was really compelling. And it had a lot of affinities and resonances for me with the way that Quakers have thought about the world in the 20th century in the United Kingdom and in America. Because linking nonviolence and equality and resistance, that exists, the coalescing of those ideas. But my sense of when the Quakers have talked about this, that to mobilize nonviolence effectively as a political force, you do also need to weave sacrifice into the narrative as well, and maybe courage. So I just wonder how you deal with those.
Well, first of all, thank you. And I'm delighted to hear about the Quaker resonance in many ways. I also think there might be resonance with certain kinds of socialist utopias that I'm drawing on. And of course, the big question for those kinds of issues is how do those smaller communities, which develop norms internal to their own working, how does that relate to a broader global field and even to a political field? And I think, my first thought is, well, what has to be sacrificed? What has to be sacrificed are the satisfactions of unbridled selfishness and violent destruction. But if that's a sacrifice, then it's an interesting way to think about it. Although I think some people would indeed say that's an intolerable sacrifice. But then the question is making it tolerable. But I worry about courage only because I think very often when we talk about courage, we talk about individual courage. And I don't think courage has to be an individual virtue. Maybe it's something that's shared. Maybe there is a kind of a way of thinking about solidarity as a shared form of courage. But I don't want to bring it back to the individual. Antigone's problem is that she wasn't willing to take any help. Her sister said, I'll take responsibility for this act. She's like, no, I'm taking it. Right? I'm going to be the courageous one, solitary, alone, radical, fatal. For me, the question I've always had about Antigone is what would happen if she had a very serious network of solidarity? Then we could have had an insurrection. And we might want to call that courage, but then it moves it out of the highly individualist domain. Anyway, thank you very much. Oh, I think there's one last. Sorry. Please. Yes.
Thank you. You provoked a question in my mind about the nature of the active protest, the active nonviolent act, as to how it might disrupt those identificatory processes that you're talking about. In other words, by making such a protest, hashtag nevertheless she persisted, or if we take Dr. Ford, for example,
yes.
By making such an active act of nonviolent protest, you move yourself from the category of those who would be defended, like us, into the category, by definition of having made the protest, of those who have to be attacked because you made the protest. So in other words, Dr. Ford might well have belonged to a category which would be protected, people like us, for whom we would commit acts of self-defense, into a category, by having made the protest, of people who it's okay to attack. They're not like us anymore because they protested.
Yes, I do follow you. And I think this is something that I am going to try to approach in the next 2 lectures. And I don't mean to postpone this because it's exceedingly important, but it is true that a form of protest against an entrenched form of power or a highly habitual form of violence, and we can think about forms of sexual violence that go along with being a 17-year-old guy, right? Like he was just a guy. That's what guys do. He was drinking beers with his friends. Let's not... In other words, there's a normalization of that form of violence, that it belongs properly to the formation of guyness, in the world. And when that gets contested, when that normalcy turns out to not only have violence in it, but be involved in the reproduction of normalizing violence, then there is very often a violent attack. And luckily she herself has not experienced violence, but she's experienced threats of violence, right, against her person. And then we're in a political quandary because there's a group of people saying, well, she's the one who's attacking him, his dignity, his reputation, right? There's an attack going this way, and then so she becomes eligible for attack. And I think we have to watch the way in which labeling protest as violent is a way of discrediting it, but it's also a way of expelling the violence onto the one who names it. And that can become very confusing, right? And you can despair and say, oh, well, we can't really decide what's violent or what's not violence because this group calls this violent and this group calls that violent. But actually, I think we can distinguish. And just because that oscillation happens and there is that kind of structure that's confusing and sometimes very enraging, doesn't mean we can't analyze it in a way to grasp that oscillation. And that's actually one thing I hope to do in the next couple of days. Thank you for your patience. Yeah.